actually, I think I'm going to allow at least 25 to 30 minutes for engagement with the audience. And so we will talk for about 30 minutes and then open it up. Okay, to my right is Chitra Nagarajaran. Yes, I don't want to get it wrong. She works with civil society groups in the northeast of Nigeria and utilizes British-funded aid to do a lot of work, and some of it with women who are caught up in the Boko Haram conflict. To my left is Fatima Abubakar, and I'm really happy to have her here. She's a photographer. She's from Borno State and has spent a lot of time capturing images of women and victims of Boko Haram, both as victims but also as normal people trying their best to live a normal life. Now, often when we have conversations about the Northeast, very rarely are we lucky to have authentic voices to talk to us. More often than not, it's third parties who tell us what is happening in Boko Haram. So I'm really grateful that Fatih is here with us. And finally, Andrew Walker. Andrew has just written a book called Eat, the Heart of the Infidel. And it is a really, I think, excellent attempt to understand Boko Haram by situating them historically and sort of well before independence and into independence, and also the Sokoto Caliphate. And I think it's significant because often people try to understand Boko Haram as a present-day phenomenon, and I think that doesn't work, because to understand the forces that shape Boko Haram, you have to understand the politics of identity, of religion, and all of those things that happen in the North. And I think Andrew does a really good job of trying to explain those forces. Thank you, everybody, for coming. Okay, so the topic is women in post-Boko Haram reality, and I'd like to start with you, Fatih. I'd like to ask, can we start talking about women in post-Boko Haram reality, or is it too early?
I definitely think that it's too early. It's not yet post-Boko Haram, as we're experiencing a lot of bomb blasts and a lot of suicide bombers coming in to the metropolis. I think it's definitely too early.
Do you get the sense from your perspective, from your people, that when this government came in and we saw this push to fight Boko Haram and we had a little bit of a relief, was there a sense of optimism among the people in Borno and the larger Northeast that perhaps this conflict was coming to an end? And how did that manifest?
Well, a lot, when the Buhari government came in, it was instant relief, because you could tell from the people you interview every day, people were really jovial for the first time, in years. And even when you go around, you can see the, tension subsiding, and people are more laid back, they're calm. It is as if, he was like a guardian angel at the time, to be honest. People believed in him, people were optimistic that it would come to an end. And people always ask, how was it before and how is it, during the Buhari regime? And I always say, like, it was completely different during the PDP reign, and it's now a complete opposite during the Buhari regime, because even the military was different when Goodluck Jonathan was in power. You could sense a recklessness. You could sense a nonchalance towards, everyday activities. People, the military was different. They didn't care, they were trigger happy. So there wasn't someone who would, put his foot down and say, this is how you treat people, they're human beings. There wasn't really any consideration for human lives. So with the Buhari regime, he has been a military man. He understands the need for, more arms and kind of funding the military so that they can properly address the issue.
Chitra, from the point of view of someone who's been working with women inside the Northeast, tell me about this issue that she raises, the before and the after. What did you used to see before, as far as women are concerned within these communities? And have you seen a substantial difference in the way the conflict is affecting them or not?
I think there's a lot of continuity in a lot of ways. I do think that the impression or the image given of women in Borno in the outside world is very much a partial picture of the story. But thinking about before and after Buhari came to power, I do see a difference. I think perhaps that's more of a function of where we are in terms of where the conflict is now. So we have had quite a few of the areas being liberated. We've had women and girls and boys who were abducted being released. There's a whole set of challenges around that which it would be useful to think about. What we're having is we're seeing lots of women and girls particularly who were associated with the group, either because they were abducted or they voluntarily joined. And we have to remember that there's a whole spectrum between coercion and voluntary joining the group, right? We're seeing that they're facing stigma, discrimination, in some cases being rejected by their families. They're seen as having been indoctrinated by the group. They're seen as threats, which in some ways is understandable because you have had women who have, this is the women who are associated with the group and other women as well,
no, but
in a
how,
way that they hadn't been before.
So how has this conflict had an impact on, if you like, the socio-cultural norms that used to exist prior to the start of the conflict, particularly when it comes to the male-female relationship, family relationships, and just the place of women within societies in the Northeast, if any?
Sure. I think that in the northeast of Nigeria, as in many conflicts, you've had women being forced to take on roles that they had previously had denied to them. So especially in the early days of the conflict, for example, you had lots of women coming out. We had protests in the streets of Maiduguri that were led by women, organized by women, calling for peace, for justice, for human rights. And that's something that you never hear about outside. You've had, just because of the number of men who are no longer there, and I think that's something that we don't really look at. It's very important to look at women, and I say this as a feminist, but we don't often talk about what's happening to the men in northeast Nigeria. If you look at IDP camps, for example, 75 to 80% of them are women and girls, which make men have been targeted both by the group and also by the military. They're viewed with suspicion. And as a result of the men not being there, women are having to increasingly take on roles that they didn't before. And so when we look ahead to when this thing ends, and we can talk a little bit about how...
I don't want us to get ahead of ourselves, because, you know, I think that is an important conversation, and I'd like Fatima eventually to talk to us from the point of view of someone who lives there, to tell us about whether she thinks there has been a significant improvement, paradoxically, in the status of women as a result of the war. But before we get to that, I'd like to bring Andrew in. I have had a conversation with you about your book, and I think it's an astonishing and courageous attempt to situate Boko Haram within history, and I think that is quite significant. But what was very telling about that book was the almost total silence on women, both from a historical perspective but also in relation to the Boko Haram conflict, except in very little parts when you talked about the suicide bombings, as well as this thing that Chitra talked about, that, you know, they play different roles. Why is that?
I don't think it's a complete silence, because it was mentioned.
I said almost complete silence.
And I did, you know, in my time in Maiduguri, I did also meet at the time one of the wives of someone who'd been involved in been found in a Boko Haram safe house, and she'd been arrested and kind of was being held as a hostage by the police. I think probably it was because I was trying to. You can't put everything into the book. You have to make a choice about where, you know, where the knife falls, I suppose. And it was a failing on my part in terms of not being able to get out and do that research. And I didn't want to make blanket pronouncements about things which I couldn't point to, very good other research that could be done. So I talked about, a little bit, highlighted what Chitra had been doing and what she'd been writing about. And so where I came across it, I tried to build it up. But you're right.
But what are the insights the few insights that you've gained? What can you tell us? Especially because you've looked at the bigger picture, if you like. What can you tell us about the role women have played in this conflict, and what the historical precedents there are, if any, around the role women have played in these kind of conflicts?
I think it's difficult to talk about it in terms of what historical precedents are, because when we go back to the previous, instances of these things, women's histories are not written, and I think that's a fairly, a big problem within history generally, not just in northeastern Nigeria. But in this, what we're seeing now is that women are taking a pivotal role in not only the resistance to Boko Haram, but also in the propagation of their creed, in the, where I spoke to people who were at the very beginning of the kind of move from the radical Salafi doctrines that had been previously circulating in terms of Izala and all this kind of stuff. When they moved further away from that in places like the Mandara Mountains, it was often the women who were most vocal and most driving those things in the village setting. So I spoke to an anthropologist who recalled that the school that he and his wife had built in their host village was burned down, and all of the books that they'd bought put in a big pile and burnt. And he was saying that this was, the people who were driving that radicalization, who turned up, with their full veil and jilbab, were the women of the village, the younger women of the village, who wanted to push that agenda forward against almost their elders, and also against, their perceived enemies in this kind of the central town, the LGA town in Groza.
Fatima, given what was obtaining in the northeast prior to Boko Haram, and particularly because it is a part of Nigeria that of course is quite mixed, and you have a sizable Christian population, did it come as a surprise to you when stories started emerging of young women who were sort of on the vanguard of trying to propagate this ideology that everybody finds frightening and hideous?
Well, I think because of the fact that a lot of women in our society, you're expected to be submissive, very obedient, so a lot of the women actually had no choice. If you marry a certain man, you follow whatever he does, and if he says, I'm going to join a terrorist group, it is only a minimal number of women you see deciding that I'm leaving him, and in our society we frown upon divorce. So I've interviewed a lot of women who said they wanted to leave, but they couldn't, because you can't go back home. He has joined the Boko Haram terrorist, and you are not accepted at home, you're not with him, so you're in the middle, left behind. So a lot of women had no choice. You had to go with him, or you had to come back to a family that was going to stigmatize you. So you end up, being alone, basically. And I think they just joined. I think generally we have a different, array of women that you meet in Borno State at the moment. You have women that are traumatized, women that were forced to, become the breadwinners because men were generally killed at the time. And then you have women that voluntarily joined the insurgency. I've been to the safe house he spoke of, and I've met the women that are real.
What are they telling you about what the drive was and the reasons for voluntarily deciding to join a group that, frankly, those of us sitting on the outside find reprehensible and horrible?
I think it's a power trip because when I was interviewing one of the women, she seemed to enjoy the power she had over the rest of the community. She loved the role that it gave her. She enjoyed being someone who was listened to, who had to be reckoned with. And honestly, it's just pure evil. You just meet women that are inherently evil and enjoy that kind of power they have over people. And in the Boko Haram ideology, mostly they're given the option of, I divorced this one, I'm going to marry that one. And the woman just sat there saying, I hate him, I divorced him, and I married his friend. So there's, a power trip that they enjoy, that the ideology gives them.
Andrew, I think she's significant. She talks about this idea of Boko Haram being an empowerment tool, because you refer to the hills of Kanama in your book, where you talked about tribes that had, run into the mountains previously as a result of jihad, and who had been basically marginalized by majority tribes in places like Goza, for whom Boko Haram provided an opportunity to actually regain some sort of power. Talk to us a little bit about what you found when you investigated and researched those particular groups of people who saw Boko Haram as a way out.
Yeah, I think it's really key to kind of understand that what Boko Haram really is about how all of these issues intersect in kind of ways, and the central thing that is left by these issues like gender, by ethnicity, by power, by land, by colonialist power, the remainder of what happened there. Inside this kind of Venn diagram of everything, in the center is what Boko Haram really is. And so I was talking to people about the Groza Hills. Unfortunately, it was not possible for me to go there at the time. I missed my opportunity. But I talked to a lot of people who know a lot about that place. And what the Dugwede people was one of the hill tribes had been experiencing for years was this marginalization. They were, when the colonial powers came to formalize the boundaries of that place, they put the administrative center in Gwoza and effectively empowered, in a similar way that they did throughout the colonial process, chose one group who would work with them and empowered them over everybody else. And that kind of tipped the power dynamic in a certain way. And it led to many of the people who refused to come down from the hills, who refused to kind of shed their own old lives as being stigmatized and being, marginalized by the people who'd been empowered at the center. The irony of it is really that, these places, the people in Gwoza were empowered and then really left by colonialism, and there's the power of the central state there has always really been just a rumor, and it's never actually reached these people in the mountains. So they have, through decades of actually quite strong trading links and all that kind of stuff, and so they had kind of been drawn into Yusuf's circle as part of a wider kind of radicalization. So when they returned back after 2009 to their place, it became like a place where they could hide, where they took the other members of the group and really grow, find new recruits. And it's no coincidence that when they came and sacked Gwoza, that was how they managed, that was a big part of their agenda, because although we talk about Boko Haram having an agenda of making an Islamic state in that area, they also are made up of subdivisions who have their own agendas. And it showed the power of the Dugwede vote, if you like, in the Shura, that Gwoza was one of the number one targets.
Chetra, let me just ask you, this issue of the complexity of the factors that have, led to the conflict with women mentally and sort of engaging with these issues, or are they sort of mostly just victims that are being swept, if you like, by events that they don't understand and that are beyond them?
Well, you talked about complexity, so there's no straight answer to that question. A lot of the women that I have spoken to, that I work with, are aware of political and social factors. They exhibit agency in the choices that they make. I think one thing that we need to look at is the role of gender roles and norms pre-conflict, which allowed this or which influenced how the conflict evolved.
And
so,
I mean, we kind of like to, sorry to jump in there, we like to sort of think of the Northeast, like I said, as one, hegemonous place, but it isn't. So there's a difference, for example, in the cultural norms of the Christian minority and the Muslim majority. And I'm wondering whether that also has impacted on roles, before Boko Haram and post Boko Haram.
Sure.
If you could talk to that as well.
I mean, one thing I think we need to remember is that the group as it is now is not how the group was in the past. And you had, especially when they started, a lot of support amongst the general society. And for women as well, following on from what Fatih was saying, that a lot of them saw the group as a chance to break free of some of the gender restrictions that were placed on them. So, for example, Muhammad Yusuf encouraged men to bring their wives, that's the founder and former leader of the group, encouraged men to bring their wives to hear him preach. He made women feel that there was a place for them in the group. And a lot of women that have been interviewed, there was this really good piece of research that was done earlier this year, which looked at young people and their motivations for joining. And for the women, they spoke about how they felt that the group offered them opportunities that they didn't have in their lives, and especially opportunities around religious education and learning. And one of the women just simply said, I had no expectations apart from I just wanted to know more about my religion. And they were teaching me about my religion. So I think we need to remember that when we look at motivations for women joining the group. Also, given, and we know that Borno, even before this happened, had some of the lowest socioeconomic indicators in the country, very low levels of enrollment in schools, in education, also issues around women and income generation and earning. And so for women, when their husbands were killed or disappeared, they lost the main breadwinner of their household. And so I spoke to many women who said, well, I was struggling to feed myself and my family, and they offered me 1,500 naira to smuggle AK-47s across a checkpoint. And it's very different. And of course, you can view that woman as a victim and vulnerable, but she's also making a conscious choice to do that. So the situation is very complicated. In general, I don't like viewing women as vulnerable victims, and I think especially when it comes to northern Nigeria and the northeast, there's this tendency to think of northern women, and especially those in the northeast, as vulnerable, they're voiceless, they're secluded, they have no power. In reality, women have a lot of power, they just exhibit it in other ways. But that doesn't
Fatih, do you agree?
I really do agree, because there was a researcher who had come in, and then I was sent the draft of the report, and it had, women being traumatized and vulnerable. It did not include women who had changed, because of the insurgency. Usually you see a woman at home time, you should be out of, the reports that come in. The constant focus is on the trauma. So I really agree with her.
And if I may ask, is this, though, are you typical, or is this a question of, the majority is a certain way, and then you have pockets of strong women, educated women, and women who've been forced to now take charge? So if we sort of do a game of ratios and numbers, how would it pan out?
Well, the percentage is low, I would say. I wouldn't lie and sugarcoat it and say all of us are like 50%. I would say like 30% of women are educated and modern, but then the rest are unfortunately uneducated women. But I really don't want to, call everybody illiterate. I think in Nigeria generally we have this focus on education. You have to be educated before you're somebody, in the country. So even if you're a successful trader, that to me is an independent woman. So we really have to stop labeling everyone and putting them in the same category. Yes, you are uneducated, but you are an independent woman fending for yourself and your children. So for me in the North, I don't really say, okay, because I'm educated, I'm much more better than the woman who became empowered, post Boko Haram. So I just think that, independence is independence regardless of education.
Nonetheless, though, Andrew, we can't run away from this indices that Chacha makes reference to, where before Boko Haram came in, and even now, the Northeast continues to be, one of the most sort of backward places in terms of education, yes, but also ability to earn a legitimate living. There are issues around the environment, for example, with desertification, which has taken its toll on people's ability to actually farm and earn a living. Was there an inevitability to the Boko Haram conflict, given these particular issues, but also the historical things that you refer to, the lack of equality, the marginalization, and the failure of government, particularly in that region of Nigeria?
I think that when I say that there was, the government was a rumor and that it wasn't really effective there, I think that shouldn't be confused with it being, a place of complete backwardness and complete desolation. I think that, in fact, the Northeast is a place where, there has been great cosmopolitan movements of people, and, has a great and deep history. And I think that part of a lot of where the misunderstanding of Boko Haram has come, I have discussions with journalists who are based in London who say, who are surprised when they find out that there's been senators and ministers and who are female from this region. And, they kind of fit it into their view of what, the submissive woman of a Muslim kind of, in a Muslim culture kind of goes. And I don't really think that fits. I think that there is, there was a lot of kind of cosmopolitan success in this area as well. People making, it may not have been particularly legitimate money making, lots of arbitrage across the borders and all this kind of stuff, and very successful markets and lots of products. But I think that what made it kind of the location of this thing was that the full recognition of the state and all of the liberal norms that come along with it had never really kind of penetrated all the way through. It was all left to its own, really. And when the state leaves somewhere to its own, it doesn't become anarchic. It becomes, a self-organized along kind of a different kind of assumption, a different kind of story that people tell each other to keep the systems of life going. And I think that has really made it, the reason why it has become this kind of, if you think about it like this is where the state has, our idea of the modern state has been kind of pushed away from this particular place because it was, ignored by it.
Right. Now, Chitra, I want to ask, before Boko Haram, we talked about the role women had, and we're now saying things have changed. So if you can, based on your experience, what are the sort of worst things that have happened as far as women are concerned in terms of sort of their position and where they stand today and the violence and all of that? And paradoxically, what are the good things that have come out of this conflict? Because you talk about empowerment. It's almost as if you're talking about women in Europe after the World War, where we saw, many come out and work, and it was almost like the genie is out of the bottle and you can't put it back. And it was the beginning of empowerment for a lot of women in Europe.
Well, I don't think I can give a complete list of all the terrible things that have happened to women and girls in Borno, but the obvious ones are a lot of them have been killed, many of them have been displaced from their homes and their communities, they've been raped, different forms of sexual violence, they've been abducted, forced into marriage, many of them have become pregnant as a result of that. You have women who are struggling to survive in terms of food and other very basic needs for sustenance, having to take care of their children, maybe their child has disappeared. You have their husbands being detained, loss of breadwinners I spoke about earlier. In the IDP camps, there was a report that was released on the 31st of October by Human Rights Watch about the levels of sexual exploitation and abuse in IDP camps by the military, by camp officials, by the police, by the civilian JTF. That's a partial list. I can't be comprehensive. If you look at, for example, the committees that have been set up to try and negotiate with the group, or if you look at the composition of government commissions, they still tend to be men and older men at that. In terms of the positive things, it can be difficult to talk of positive things coming out of conflict because it's come out of pain and suffering and violence. And what may be seen as positive to us is not necessarily positive to the women concerned. So does a particular woman think that it's positive for her now to have to go out to try and find work? It's difficult, right? So I think women now are having to support themselves economically, having to make decisions in a way that they didn't before. Women also have been really active in civil society, and I spoke earlier about the marches that took place in my degree, and this was amazing because this was during the height of the conflict and the violence in my degree, and they were marching to government to demand justice, demand peace, demand the fulfillment of human rights obligations, and I think that that's really remarkable. The women of my degree are absolutely fantastic. They were raising the issue. They were raising issues around abductions way before the April 2014. In terms of looking ahead to the future, you talked about Europe, and yes, after the World Wars, women had that space precisely because they had to take on roles that they didn't before. But you have to remember there was also a backlash against that. And I think that a useful example is maybe not Europe post-Second World War, but Rwanda and Liberia and Sierra Leone and many other countries on the continent. And what we have seen over and over again is that women take on decision-making roles that they didn't have before. And then after the conflict ends, by which I mean after the bullets stop firing, because I believe that violence against women and girls is another type of conflict and endemic in our societies, what we find is that a lot of times violence against women actually goes up. So you have, especially when men return back to their communities, they're not necessarily pleased by the increased decision-making power that women have taken.
Now, before I open it up, I want to quickly ask Fatima, have the attitudes to women changed from men? And here I'm talking about men and sort of the wider society.
Well, to be honest, the attitude towards women has changed completely, like in conventional Kanuri society, because that's the Mejo tribe. Their jobs, their professions that are frowned upon for a woman to start. For example, like I'm a photographer, and that is not something we have ever seen in my tribe before. So people are now becoming accepting of, modernity and the gender roles changing, and men are accepting the fact that women are going to lead. And you have people saying, I respect you a lot because you have a profession that you are so passionate about. And men now actually look for women who have, careers. They don't really want a woman sitting at home doing anything, doing nothing. I mean, even if it's frying akara outside, at least you're bringing income. So we're seeing a lot of change in the attitudes of men and how they really crave for independent women.
But your expectation based on experience is that when the conflict finally comes, there may be resistance to
There can be, yes. And I think, when I talk about violence, I think we need to look at all forms of violence that women have experienced during this conflict. And a lot of time people talk about sexualized forms of violence. But for example, there are some indications, anecdotal, based on the women that I've spoken to, about an increase in terms of early marriage. So you have, for example, at least a few months ago, you had men going to IDP camps to find cheap brides because they couldn't afford anymore the bride price that women... you want to say something about that?
I wanted to add to that, the pros of men craving independent women are there, but the cons are the fact that you're not going to be at home a lot, and the men quickly realize that they desire an independent woman, but once the chips are down, they really also want someone who is going to be at home, who is going to be submissive. So after a while, they start feeling emasculated, and then you have a second wife coming in who will do all of the work while you're away. So I think it is good that women are becoming independent, but the men, post Boko Haram are going to realize, okay, maybe she's too powerful, and then they might not want that.
Yeah, and there was a research study that I did earlier looking at masculinities, conflict and violence, which covered Borno as well as Kaduna, Lagos and Rivers. And what that found actually was that men were happy with their women going out to earn money as long as it didn't upset power relations within the household. And if they felt that it did, then the women experienced a lot of backlash. So we had women saying to us, I feel that, especially women who earned more than men, and this was across Nigeria, right? That they felt that as their economic earning power increased, that they felt an increasing pressure to prove their submissiveness more and more and more, and actually it just added to their burdens. So I think that this is a very interesting dynamic. Sure, men are happy for women to go out and earn money because it contributes to the household, but as long as it doesn't just detract from their own power within the households and the way that the community views them. And I think that it's, but I have to also say that looking at the experience of other African countries who have experienced conflict and violence, we find that a lot of times women are not happy to be pushed back into the home and into the kitchen. And so there'll be conflict within the household there. And a lot of times the result of that is increasing levels of domestic violence against women and girls. And I think that's something that we should be looking at and that we should start planning for now in terms of how we address and prevent this from coming about.
Thank you very much. Okay, so I want to open it up to questions, comments. Could you keep it short, please? Because I want to get as many people as possible. So what we will do is start from, my right. There's a lady and a gentleman there, yes.
Good morning, all. This is going to be really short because I didn't really have a question, just a comment. I just got a lot from it, but I'm glad that even though we all haven't been able to solve this and there are no easy answers or no quick solutions, the fact that you're willing to let yourself grapple with it in all its complexity is really impressive, and I wanted to thank you for that.
Thank you.
I had a question for Fatih. I wanted to hear about your process a little bit. I'm really interested in knowing about your relationship with your subjects. Like how do you select them, trying to see when you take portraits of these women?
Well, when I go out, I don't really have a selection criteria. I just think that everybody should be interviewed, everybody should be given a voice. So I don't really look around for a specific person. I just, when I see someone, it could be anything. I'll just stop them and then ask for consent, which is very important. Do you want your portrait taken? This is how it's going to be. This is where it's going. Are you comfortable with talking about your experiences? If they're fine with it, then that's when we take a portrait. And a lot of times, you see people very open to it. And I think before Boko Haram, we were a community that it was almost shameful to talk about your problems, even to your neighbor. But with, Boko Haram and everybody really exhausted by everything they've experienced, they're really open to at least someone listening to them and possibly solving their problems. So it's individual, it varies. One individual can be very open, another will still be very conservative, and especially women, they don't, because of their husbands or how the society is going to view them, they really don't want to be photographed. So I move on to the next person who is willing to share his or her experience.
And just, I'm curious because you're, doing your photography, the expectation is, I think, maybe prejudice comes into this, but the expectation is that your pictures are all going to be dark and sad, and yet, actually, when you look at them, there are a lot of joyful pictures, children laughing, children playing, a child trying to study over, using a lamp, so sort of images of everyday normalcy that you capture. How is that possible, given what is going on in that place?
I think, why I started essentially is because of what I had seen other people doing. There's a complete disregard for a person's dignity. For example, if there's an IDP camp, you just see a reporter who'll come in with his camera and just point it at the person. I think it's very, very wrong. I wouldn't accept my photo being taken and then made a poster, or a flyer for, a food campaign. I think it's completely wrong. So I decided I'm not going to do that to my people. I'm going to humanize them, give them the dignity that they deserve. So I asked your consent. I make sure that you're properly dressed. I don't like seeing children, half naked and then they're on a big poster. I really hate it. So I make sure, I tell the mother, dress him, clean him up. We're going to do a beautiful portrait. Sometimes I even print it out for the family so they can have memories, of when they were in a camp, which is sad. But,
Yeah,
I just want to ask a follow-up question to that, because I think it's significant. Can your work therefore be said to be an authentic representation if there's a lot of, if you like, attempt to sort of arrange things? How do you see your work?
Well, a lot of people tell me I break all the rules, but it doesn't really matter to me. Somebody will wake up one day and, define how you work and write it in a book and say, this is the, golden rule of photography and this is what you need to follow. I don't really agree. I just think that you have to be a trailblazer, pave the way for yourself, define how you're going to work, and if it fits you. I really insist on cultural sensitivity. So whatever, dignifies my community, I'm willing to break the rule.
Thank you.
I'd like to say something about your photographs as well, in that it may not be like journalistic reportage photography, but it shows to me a kind of truth that I see when I first came to Nigeria and I started traveling to the north, and I fell in love with this place that was so colourful, so friendly, and even in the space of great inequality and great unfairness and things that I as a foreigner would come around and see, and seeing your pictures reminds me of that every time I see those pictures, and reminds me that it's still there, even though there's this terrible thing going on, and I really appreciate that.
Thank you very much.
Okay, so there's two ladies in front, then the gentleman at the back, and then we'll move to this side.
Good morning. I would like to know the female children that were impregnated by the insurgents. Are they given warmth? Like, are they accommodated, or do they also receive backlash, and are they rejected and ostracized by the community?
You're talking about girls who
girls, yeah, who face...
I think that the picture is a bit mixed. I think in a lot of times, as I mentioned earlier, they're viewed with suspicion and distrust. People think that they've been indoctrinated, that they will cause them problems or danger in the future. There's this one case about this girl who, every time the fighter planes would go over the IDP camp, used to just go into a fit and a spasm, and her community interpreted that as her being afraid because she had her sympathies with the group and she was worried about what would happen to that. But it could also be that it brought back bad memories for her, and she was traumatized by what she experienced. So there's that. But on the other hand, I find that communities can be very understanding of what they experience, especially if they feel that it was involuntary. So, for example, a girl who was abducted is much more likely to be treated with more sympathy than a girl who chose to join because they were paying her some money or something along that nature. I think as well there's been a lot of work that has been done by women in my degree to go into IDP camps to talk about this, which is useful. I've also heard of cases of husbands rejecting girls, especially when they find out that they're pregnant. I heard about this one particular case of a woman who had been, a girl who'd been newly married. I think she was 6 months married, and then she was abducted. And when she came back, she was taken for testing, and she tested negative for STDs, but found out that she was pregnant, and her husband divorced her on the spot in that clinic. So the situation is a bit mixed. I think that another area of concern is what happens when people go home. Research that came out earlier this year, that was done by International Alert and UNICEF, it's called Bad Blood, found that communities, even if they were accepting of the women and girls who were abducted now, worried that when they returned home, that there would no more be security forces around them, so that they would be at increased risk, that they'd start meeting and talking again, and that something would happen. And I think a lot of this is intensified exactly by the stigma and marginalization and discrimination that these women and girls experience. You have a lot of girls saying, I want to go back to my husband. I'm sure you've seen this in the press as well. And it's not surprising because they're actually not treated very well a lot of times in communities. But I don't want to say that they're all treated badly, because there are some families, some community leaders, some religious leaders who really understand what they've gone through and try and help them. But frankly speaking, there's also an issue of insufficiency of services as well. So even though a lot of these girls are receiving psychosocial support, it's not enough.
Thank you. Yeah.
Good morning. I wanted to ask Fati and Chitra a question. Do you guys face backlash for like your work and your work? Do you guys face backlash, like any form of backlash?
No, to be honest, I don't really receive any backlash. You kind of get the occasional glance of disapproval, I think, but that's about it. Nobody like openly harasses you, and that's what I'm saying.
Have you not actually become a bit of a rock star?
Well, that was after the work became successful, but before that I was just, viewed as a jobless person, aimlessly wandering. So, but, after like with the Boko Haram insurgency, like I said, there's been a change in roles. Women are now viewed as heroes. You have women running NGOs, you have women coming in and becoming leaders. So actually, currently, like, women are heroes.
Yeah, no problem. I don't think I would experience backlash anyway, because I'm not Nigerian, right? But I can talk about how the women that I work with are seen, and I think exactly like Fati said, a lot of men have a lot of respect and admiration for women and what they've done. You also have to remember that women are part of the civilian JTF and vigilante groups, and actually responsible for securing the safety and the physical safety and security of people, in addition to everything else that the women have been doing in Northeast Nigeria.
Over here.
Sorry, I have the mic.
So from here to there. Yeah.
My question is to Fati. I really admire the sensitivity with which you approach your work, and I'm very interested in you as a photographer. So, there's a sense in which sometimes when something happens that sort of disrupts society, it overshadows you as an artist, and it's sort of like a calling to kind of to serve the need that is presented. So I'm just curious with you and your process, and for example, if there was no Boko Haram, what would your work be about? What would you be about? I don't know, could you just talk about that a little?
Maybe talk about whether you actually do work that is not just about Boko Haram.
Well, before I, started the page, I was actually a photographer, going to, communities. I had been commissioned by, like Kwara State government, for example, to photograph the town and create a page that will talk about the beauty of the state. So even before coming back to Borno State to start the page, I was working as a photographer, and I was being commissioned to do a lot of work. And I think that I really do think before Boko Haram, before starting the page, I was really, aspiring to be a photographer. And, the Boko Haram insurgency has been a catalyst in a way for us to step in and kind of do a counter narrative. So I think that yes, it has contributed to becoming what I am, which is really necessary. And so I accept the fact that that is the topic that I've chosen, and without the topic, possibly I have to, be honest to myself, I wouldn't have been here. I would have been other places, talking about different topics. But then Boko Haram is something I'm passionate, Borno State, is something I'm passionate about, and I stepped in and did that. And even after Boko Haram, I'm going to continue to other communities where you can address similar issues. So the work is continuous. It will not stop because, Boko Haram ended.
Okay, over here, please. No, excuse me, we will do this systematically. So can you give me, thank you. We will come to you, but let's do this side because we haven't touched anybody on this side.
I will say well done, a job well done. Also, I would like to comment about education in the North. I know in the North we are backward in Western education, but over 200 years ago, we can read and write in Arabic, and we can even use the Arabic alphabet into our own languages. So I don't think, if you are talking about education, yes, Western education, we are backward, but in other education, North is all right.
Thank you. The gentleman right at the back, and then we walk our way back.
Can I just say something about that, about education?
Yes, go
on. I mean, this is the part of the where the friction comes in how we look at it, in that, we in the West are kind of guilty of thinking that this is just one form of education is valid. And whilst I'm, I wouldn't, totally advocate only the Al-Majri system, it doesn't necessarily turn out people who are blind and willing killers for Boko Haram. It's not. There's not one thing doesn't lead to the other. And as you say, that there are, a deep and long history of education and writing that dates back thousands.
To add to that, I really do agree, we shouldn't really look at one form of education. That's why I insist, in Nigeria, you're only viewed as something when you're, educated in the Western way of things. But we have to accept that, Islam, even if you're really well-versed in your culture, that is an education. So we shouldn't really focus on only one form. And
so let me ask you though, isn't that the reason why the tendency is to examine this critically, is because on the surface there doesn't seem to be a material impact on the lives of people as a result of this particular kind of education, one, and that two, the quality where it is not evenly available to the majority, and therefore ideologies that are, if you like, very strong, can actually fill a vacuum that exists. Isn't that part of the problem? And if in some ways, aren't we in denial when we sort of keep, it's almost as if in the North we get offended by it instead of sort of facing the reality of what it is and what it has cost us.
Well, to be honest, in Borno State, for example, if you're highly educated, they call you Nasara. You're acting like the Westerners. You're not accepting of the fact that you're Kanuri. There's even, you're even bullied for it. So I do think, yes, we're in denial, but I also think that, not everybody should, be fit in this template where society thinks you should. We have tribes like the Maasai, that are still, steeped in their traditional cultures, and they're still important people in the society. I'm just saying that if you don't have a chance to be educated, you should also be respected for having your culture and learning other forms of education. We have tribes that are, don't agree with modernity, but they're still leaders in their own right. So I'm just saying there shouldn't be a strict adherence to this is what you need to be. It should be an option.
And then we'll go to the gentleman.
Sorry. Let me just say something quickly. That I absolutely agree, and I think that it's really people in the countryside, when they think about education, 40, 60, 50 years ago, people want number one thing that you would hear, apparently, if you went to them and said, what do you want, is education, education, education. Now, all this time later, it's actually, it's the fault of poorly state-run programs of education that have been completely useless, that show it's a complete waste of time. People have this reaction that it kind of denigrates their culture, which, is something that maybe can be dealt with, but or can be influenced and changed. But it's also the complete waste of time often that going through education system is in Nigeria. And it's a reaction to that. So it's a failure of Western education rather than people turning back to a kind of a primitive thing.
And it's not just about the education system, but the fact that you study and you work hard for years and years, and then even if you graduate from university, can you get a job? And we know that there's such a high rate of youth unemployment, including for graduates. So even if you study and you're educated and you reach the apex of education, which is a university degree, what is the point of all of that? And I think we have to remember, a lot of people say that violence comes from poverty, and actually study after study after study shows it's not poverty, it's inequality. And so people are angry at what they see as injustice. And there was a study that was done a couple of years ago that compared northern Nigeria and southern Niger. Very similar in terms of culture, religion, etc., language. But why is it that this happened in Nigeria and not in Niger? Especially when the poverty levels, people are poor in Niger as well, right? And what it found was actually in Nigeria, we have higher levels of inequality. And so a lot of people saw that even no matter how hard they worked and no matter how hard they studied, they couldn't actually move anywhere, and yet at the same time, you had these people who were getting richer and richer and richer. And I had a colleague who recently came to my degree to live there for the first time, and he lives in Lagos, is from the East, and he always says, I feel like the politicians in Borno, if you compare them to the politicians elsewhere, they stole the most, because you just look at their houses, and there are lots of very, very nice houses of politicians in Borno, and yet you have people who are still struggling despite how hard they
so
work.
maybe the question we'll end on is whether the problem can be addressed without dealing with this particular issues. But I'd like to get more people in before we get there. Yes,
my name is Ibrahim. My question is for Andrew. Even though the current government are doing a brilliant work in terms of the success of the military in fighting Boko Haram, don't you think that the government are doing little, if not nothing, in terms of tackling the ideology behind Boko Haram, that is the Islamist ideology? Because one thing I've learned about ideology is that you can't kill an ideology with a bullet, so you might wipe out the whole Boko Haram terrorist, but once the ideology is there, in the next few years you can have another Boko Haram. So what do you think the government should do in terms of tackling the ideology?
It's difficult. It really faces an uphill struggle, and I think that you're absolutely right. There could be the circumstances exist for another group to come up. We have seen, even despite what the government is doing, they are antagonizing other groups already in the terms of the Shia violence that we've seen, and it really has to kind of change its attitude of just being able to. It only has 3 gears: do nothing, destroy it, or ban it. And that really doesn't work in any kind of functioning state. And it's really difficult to see how they're going to change that at all.
You sort of documented the fact that actually even before independence, starting with the push against colonialism, and later fighting against domination by the House of Fulani Caliphate, the Sokoto Caliphate, that we've had pockets of this sort of resistance. Nothing on the scale we've seen today with Boko Haram, but where religion, and particularly actually Islam, has provided, if you like, a fertile ground for people to try and resist oppression and marginalization and all that. And yet it seems as if lessons have not been learned.
It's difficult to know what exactly would have to happen to stop that happening. This process of a charismatic individual drawing people to him in an urban or semi-urban setting out, and maybe you're going to create a new kind of supposedly pure space, is a process that is not really included in the idea of the Westphalian state. You know, we don't really know how to deal with it, and I don't know if there is any way of dealing with it in that kind of way. And I think that it's right that here, in this particular setting, in this particular history, in this particular time, both forms of resistance and kind of self-governance are kind of particularly Islamic in flavour. I mean, we can discuss about whether they are really Muslims or whether they are in fact deluded, but it takes on that particular topos or that particular character.
Okay, so the gentleman, where is the microphone? So let's do that row, then the two people, then the lady in front, yeah? And then we're going to...
Thanks very much to all the panelists. So I have a question about social class, which I think was implicit in many things discussed so far. I wonder to what extent there is a sort of link or correlation between all the perception of all the women you worked with and the social backgrounds, whether they come from a low-income family or a wealthy family. Because, as Chitra suggested, there might be, it might be understandable that a widowed woman who has lost everything would be attracted to money provided by Boko Haram. But so it happens at an individual level, as Fatih said. So there's this individual dynamic. But what about the social dynamic? Is there a collective movement linked to social class?
Okay, and before you answer, because we're running quickly out of time, I think I want to take at least two more questions and then we'll come back to the panel. Yes, sir.
Okay, thank you very much for the deliberation. I'm very much chuffed and excited that the discussion has taken this direction. But my
hang on,
interest...
please, as you come in, can you be quiet? We are having a conversation. Thank you.
My interest is in trying to see how to reverse the impact of Boko Haram in the northeast. These guys are aggressively fighting against what we term Western education and all that. What is, or what do you think the private sector in the northeast is doing to reverse this trend? Because if you talk about people who are wealthy, politicians who are well-to-do, are they looking at 50 years from now, the impact of all of this? How are they trying to, reverse the effect of, Boko Haram in the northeast?
Thank you, sir. The person next to him in yellow? Yes, yeah.
Okay. Mine is more of an apology. With where I come from in Ghana, at least persons have come across, at the mention of Boko Haram and Maiduguri, really nobody wants to have a conversation. In fact, when I downloaded the app for this occasion, and I saw this subject, I was like, can I just come get a book and go back home safely, But having heard you guys and the hard work that you've put in and against the negativity, I would want to seize this opportunity to applaud your efforts. And quickly, but for her intervention, my mom's intervention with Islam having been introduced 200 years ago and everything she said, it's sort of pricked a deliberation in my mind that the whole issue is if Boko Haram had decided to introduce itself, minus the abduction and the rape and all the savagery that comes with them, they could have made an inroad trying to reach out to people rather than to adopt the brute force that comes with them.
Thank you. Now let's come back to the panel. Fatih, you wanted to start.
Well, in answer to his question about the social class, I think a lot of people make the mistake of thinking that it is poor, uneducated women that have joined Boko Haram. There are a lot of, educated women from wealthy families who have made the conscious decision to join Boko Haram. Like, for example, in one of the safe houses where the real wives of Boko Haram are kept, you have an educated young lady, she speaks 3 languages, she has a degree, but her father was wealthy. She joined Boko Haram, voluntarily. So I think we shouldn't say, this class has a higher number and this class has a less number. So I think I agree. I think that we haven't spoken on social class, and people need to know that it's both sides that have joined.
I mean, Andrew, your book showed that in the early days of Muhammad Yusuf, a lot of the people who, patronized him and who allowed him to grow were actually wealthy people. And the infamous man who, did the suicide bombing at the United Nations, for example, was wealthy enough to leave behind a sizable inheritance for his
children.
For his children,
absolutely.
Yeah. So.
I think, and he was a driver. He was, a commercial driver. So he came from that kind of slice of life. But he was, fairly successful in that. But also at the very beginning, there were a lot of students who tore up their certificates, who burnt them, who made public declarations that they were moving away from this thing. And I think in a lot of ways, those Salafi movements do tend to attract people of wealth as well, because there is an idea that it is a kind of powerful club, and it's also a way of purifying wealth, and it's also it attracts, if you just have to see the present, although they're not violent, the popularity of Izalo amongst leaders, you can see that drift towards radicalization is not just for poor people.
Exactly, and I think that this is really important, because I think a lot of times there's a misconception that the group is full of poor, uneducated people, and as both Fatine and Andrew mentioned, that's just not true. Also, I think we need to think about what do we mean by being part of a group, because if you include the sponsors, they're also, they're amongst the wealthy, the businessmen, politicians, etc. And I think it's really important to remember that. Your question about what the state is doing, I think it's important to look at the use of economic incentives to draw people into the group.